you've stumbled onto this video, or really any of my content, odds are you at least know about the
TurboGrafx-16, the next generation video game system.
And if you know about the Turbo, you probably know about Bonk, Splatterhouse, Blazing Lasers, you know, the more popular titles that tend to come up. But what if I told you that there was something deeper? That this rabbit hole can go much further. Truth is, there's a few dozen games on the TurboGrafx that just don't get talked about, many of which I haven't even brought up. Well, that ends today. So here, I want to examine the unexamined. I want to shine a light directly on a handful of Turbo games that just seem all but forgotten. I've never considered Sinistron to be one of my favorite shooters on the Turbo, but it's definitely got some strong points, and I do rather like it overall. The main thing that sets it apart is the ship's jaws, as the manual refers to them, but I feel like it's more of a beak, so I'll call it that instead. You can open up your ship's beak to increase the spread of your fire, but in so doing you weaken your weapon slightly and also expose the more vulnerable cockpit. The beak will absorb some enemy fire, so keeping it closed whenever possible is the safest bet. But if you're getting overwhelmed, as you eventually will, opening up the beak to either of its other two positions will help you take enemies out faster, usually. The game makes you use your best judgment to determine how defensive or offensive you want to be at any given time, and gives you the flexibility to do that as long as your weapon is upgraded. This gives Sinistron an interesting vibe that most shmups don't quite have. Maybe it clicks with you, maybe it doesn't, but at the very least, it's a neat concept. Sinistron's three weapons are the flame cannon, the laser, and the homing missiles, all of which do slightly different levels of damage, but again, the position of the beak is far more impactful than the weapon you have equipped in my experience. I feel like the laser is pretty good in most situations, but you could get by with any of them, so it mostly does come down to preference, which I like. Some shooters effectively require certain weapons in certain situations, and if you don't know what's coming up next, that can be really annoying, so I like that Sinistron doesn't do that. You also have a chargeable blast that you can use by turning the turbo switch down and holding onto the fire button for a couple of seconds. It's kind of a measly little thing though, it doesn't do much damage, and it has a pretty small radius, so it's almost never really worth doing outside of maybe a couple situations. Kind of a wasted opportunity there. Speed pickups and shield pods are also very important in Sinistron, and yes, you will lose all of them every time you die, which will definitely happen a lot, as Sinistron gets absolutely brutal by Stage 4. The first and second levels are pushovers, 3 is a moderate challenge, and then from Stage 4's asteroid field and on, you'll be getting bombarded on a nearly constant basis. Sinistron gets so hard that it's actually one of the few Turbo games I've never legitimately beaten. I've only been able to get to this level before I start losing my mind. I have a great time up until then though. Sinistron's graphics are quite good in my opinion, and are one of its strongest elements, with lots of vibrant colors and parallax scrolling layers, at least in the first couple stages, and great use of different palettes giving each stage an extremely distinct vibe. I really like the way Stage 3 looks in particular, like you're in some kind of a glowing neon intestinal tract. Pretty neat. Every stage has a cool look to it though, and it's worth admiring the work that Alpha System put into them. They managed to make this game in less than a year after releasing Cybercore, which is still probably the better game overall, but the massive leap in visuals from Cybercore to Sinistron is undeniable. They also totally nailed the music here too. Again, Sinistron carves out its own weird and interesting identity with music that evokes the strangeness of an alien world, but still keeps the energy high, just like it did in Cybercore. Most of the tracks here seem to harken back to the same melodic theme, which is kind of an interesting direction compositionally for a video game, and yet the songs still manage to match their levels individually, so I'm impressed. I wasn't able to find out who wrote the music in Sinistron, as the names in the credits are all pseudonyms, but whoever you are, great work. NEC apparently thought Sinistron had a good shot at being a thing, since they did give it a front-page illustration in TurboPlay magazine, but it would immediately get blown out of the water by shoot-'em-ups on other systems, and even other shooters on the Turbo. So there just wasn't really room for Sinistron to have the spotlight long enough to make much of an impact. It made an impact on me, though. While I don't really like how absurdly difficult it gets, and it probably wouldn't even crack my top 10 Turbo games, it'll still always have a spot among shmups that I like, and I occasionally recommend to people, especially those that are looking for something a little different. Drop-Off is the only Turbo game I've talked about before outside of this video. I covered it in my Weird TurboGrafx Games video, and I only bring that up to point out that it is quite strange and a really good example of how quirky and interesting the Turbo's library can be. Despite that, Drop-Off rarely comes up in conversations about the Turbo, and when it does, it's usually somebody hating on it. And to that I say, shut up, idiot. Drop-Off is great. I mean, it's about as great as a brick-breaking Arkanoid-like can be, but within the confines of that little genre, I think it does a lot of neat things. Right off the bat, the story of Izumi being possessed by somebody, or as the Japanese version of the game puts it, obsessed by somebody, is an extremely bizarre way to set up what is functionally just a brick breaker. But it does sort of contextualize the different objects the different stages are based on, because they're all things that Izumi is dreaming about. Now, it never really explains why breaking them all down with a ball and a paddle is a solution to that situation, but it's a video game. What do you want? You'll be breaking down everything from apples, strawberries, coins, and emeralds, which don't really behave any differently, but the arrangements of the objects get more complex as the game goes on, forcing you to keep moving your paddle around to stay alive. Everything is constantly lowering down towards you at a steady pace throughout the stages, which can slowly fill you with anxiety, almost kinda like Clax. Although you do get a couple of chances per level to shoot everything back up just a little bit and give you a little bit of breathing room. Outside of that, though, you'll be focusing on using your little paddle to bounce the ball around and cut everything down and score as many points as possible. Unlike other brick breakers, though, you don't necessarily have to hit every object to advance. You really just need your paddle to survive to the end. This usually requires carving out a safe path for it, but of course the natural instinct to take out as many strawberries or whatever as possible will kick in. Now, if you really want to get fancy, you can cut off huge swaths of them at once, which can rack up some nice score bonuses and give you some satisfying little hits of dopamine. You also come across occasional power-ups, like this one that makes the ball cut through everything like butter. Your paddle can also make the ball bounce more vertically or horizontally at any time depending on the configuration. This can give you a lot more control over the situation if you know when to switch it up. Another thing to watch out for is the disintegrating floor. Some levels don't have this, but most of them have floors that are made up of tiles that can only be hit a few times before they disappear, and if your ball goes down that hole, you lose a life. So protect the paddle and protect the floor. Drop-Off has some great design cues that add to its weirdness. Like, why are these lion things here? Why did these turn into cats before falling down? Why did these turn into college professors? And why is this tractor here? I guess it can all be explained by the dreamlike state of Izumi, but I don't know. I kind of prefer not really understanding it and just embracing the weirdness. Now, if you're able, I highly recommend playing this game with a joystick of some kind and not a standard D-pad. If you're emulating the game or playing it on a clone console of some sort, then a DualShock 4, Xbox controller, or anything else with a joystick will do. Or if you're on original hardware, the Turbo Stick is perfect. Or one of these bad boys from BD Retro Mods. Either way, a joystick does wonders for this game since your paddle can go all over the screen. Control-wise, you should basically treat it like a shmup. Drop-Off takes the breakout concept and gives it a few clever twists, and in so doing, it sets itself apart in a genre that's absolutely full of interchangeable clones. In fact, I'd say this is one of the more interesting brick-breaking games ever, alongside Devilish on the Genesis, which is also outstanding. There's only so many permutations of objects and arrangements of said objects that Drop-Off can do before it starts to lose a little bit of its luster, sure. But if you like weird puzzle games that test your reflexes, Drop-Off is a must-play. the rare occasions where silent debuggers does get brought up, it's sometimes called a very early example of first-person shooters and even horror games. And yeah, I think that's a fair way to describe it. Everything from the claustrophobic atmosphere, the tight resource management, and near constant tension the game creates certainly makes survival horror shooter about as accurate a phrase as we could use to describe it today. Silent Debuggers takes place on a derelict space station that's been overrun with alien bugs, with two operatives sent to clean house. You and this guy who likes to hang back in the computer room and tell you what to do. You have 6 levels to clear out, and you have exactly 100 minutes to finish the entire game. So yeah, if you make it to the very end and run out of time,
you blew it.
You also lose 5 minutes automatically every time you die, so don't do that. The best way to avoid dying is to use your audio and visual cues wisely. The game generally lets you know when you're close to a bug. Different colored bugs behave in different ways, but the principle is the same. Find them and kill them. Every level has a slightly different arrangement of cores, which you'll want to protect from the bugs, as you need these rooms to resupply ammo and health. You also have the outer blocks, which is where the bugs are mostly located, and you'll be doing most of your delousing. The key is to memorize the quickest paths back and forth though, since certain bugs will sneak by you and start attacking your cores at any time, so you'll be needing to run back and forth fairly often. The game does give you a map that you can check, which isn't as helpful as I would have liked, but it's better than nothing, and the time pauses while you're using it, so take your time there. To make things even more complicated, you have multiple weapons that behave wildly differently, and a handful of items like auto chargers for your batteries, upgrades for your guns, and even teleporters that can zip you around the map really fast in exchange for a big chunk of your battery. So there's quite a lot going on here, much more than you might expect from a 1991 TurboGrafx game. Data East really knew what they were doing by this point. They had already put out the excellent Bloody Wolf and Override on the PC Engine. Silent Debuggers would end up being their last official release on the system, and it's quite a way to go out. I gotta say though, I think the game is an acquired taste. Don't expect to wrap your arms around everything it's doing within your first few attempts. And like I said, the repetitive hallways make memorizing the levels pretty tough, at least for me, so be prepared to be in and out of menus a lot. Even now, I still kinda have trouble putting all of this game's pieces together to get the most out of it, but when it is all clicking into place, you can really see some glimmers of genius here. Games like System Shock and Dead Space do make me think they might owe a little something to Silent Debuggers. Had they been able to squeeze just a little more juice out of the Turbo with more varied levels and perhaps leaned into the horror aspect a little bit more, perhaps it wouldn't have faded into obscurity so quickly, but as it is, I think it's a perfectly respectable attempt at something quite ambitious, and it's pretty fun despite a steep learning curve. Tiger Road from Capcom is a decent little action platformer for the Turbo, though I've never been entirely sure if I particularly like it or not. I certainly don't hate it though. It's got the fundamentals down with some good platforming, levels that don't overstay their welcome, and some relatively catchy, above-average music. Like a lot of Turbo games, Tiger Road is actually a reworked port of a Japanese arcade game. You get 3 primary weapons in Tiger Road. The axe, which is fast but has short range, the mace, or Morning Star, which has much longer reach but much slower attack speed, and this thing, which the manual calls a sword, but I've always thought it looks more like one of those batons you see marching band leaders use. In any case, this thing seems to provide no real advantage at all, with extremely short range and very few situations where it even feels adequate. You can technically upgrade your weapons, but the effects are basically unnoticeable. I mean, with the marching band baton, for example, you go from a short, stubby little guy to a slightly less stubby little guy, and it's still basically just as useless. And Tiger Road seems to enjoy giving you items to avoid, as the health pickups are similarly weird. Blue gives you some life, red gives you a whole bunch, and yellow takes life away. So, yellow bad, blue okay, and red is great. This goes against all video game logic ever, so don't feel bad if you never get used to it. power downs and troll weapons aren't a problem for me in general though. My actual issues with Tiger Road lie in the cheap hits that you'll often get when enemies spawn in super unfair spots that give you literally no time to react, and the extremely annoying knockback that occurs when you do get hit, which often knocks you right back into the pit you were just trying to jump over. Given that enemies constantly spawn in while you advance through the levels, this is a borderline unavoidable problem at times. It seems like Tiger Road is sort of going for a Contra or Ninja Spirit type of thing with the constant flow of enemies, but with the limited range of these weapons, no ability to attack up or down, the game just doesn't really have the flexibility or the responsiveness to pull off that sort of gameplay very well. That doesn't ruin the game, but it does kind of hold it back into sort of mediocre territory much of the time. Now, the gameplay does have some bright spots. The enemy variety is pretty decent, with different levels all introducing new baddies to the roster, most of which behave at least a little bit differently from each other and make you switch up your tactics. So if you don't learn how to take them on properly, you won't make it very far in any level. The levels themselves also switch things up nicely with platforming stages, single-screen boss areas, little challenges between levels, and even these auto-scrolling sections where you suddenly fly for some reason and now have to take out enemies while avoiding hazards and keeping up with the scrolling. I appreciate the variety these flying levels provide, but I could do without them. They are pretty short, so you can fumble your way through them without losing any lives, but they're just not very well implemented. I enjoy the platforming stages the most. Some of them are big enough to have multiple possible routes and hidden items, which is cool. Although for some reason you're not allowed to jump down, which is dumb. And since all levels are also annoyingly timed, the game automatically de-incentivizes exploring them very much, which is just one of the many reasons that I hate time limits in games like this. Tiger Road keeps things moving though, which saves it from being dragged down too far by any one element. This is far from a great game, but now that I've typed all my thoughts out like this in a script, made a few edits, and now that I'm reading that script into a microphone for the voiceover to this video, I think I finally realized that I do like this game, but only in small bursts. It's sort of the quintessential 5 or 6 out of 10 game that doesn't really do anything super poorly, but also doesn't excel anywhere either. If you're a fan of platformers and all you need is just some good music and fast-paced enemy encounters to keep you going, you could do a lot worse than Tiger Road. Just don't expect to play it for more than 10 minutes or so before you'll want to move on to something else. Cratermaze is an outstanding little game for the TurboGrafx, and honestly, I regret not finding a spot for it in either of my Best of the Turbo videos, because I really do think this is one of the system's better games. Ah well, I'm including it now. Most who have played Cratermaze will liken it to Bomberman, and while I definitely see the similarities there, to me it really feels more like that Batman game on the PC Engine, which is another one I highly recommend and hope to cover sometime. Cratermaze was actually a Doraemon game on the PC Engine, but after some significant overhauls with the characters and music, it became Cratermaze for us. I guess Hudson Soft just didn't think we could handle a Doraemon game in the US. Although I do like this version of the game better, so maybe they were right. Cratermaze hinges on the simple concept of strategically digging little holes for enemies to fall into, grabbing all of the treasure chests, and escaping the level before time runs out. You can even bury enemies alive to get rid of them, which is kind of a dark thing to do in such a cheery little game. You don't technically have to do that though. In fact, if you don't kill any enemies by the time you've collected all the treasure, you'll be given this little NEC icon to collect that's worth 20,000 points, and each defeated enemy is only worth 1,000. So unless you plan on burying 20 enemies alive in a single level, might as well just go for this to maximize your score. As the game progresses, it adds more and more layers of things to consider though, like little wormholes that teleport you to different spots, water that will absolutely result in death despite how refreshing it looks, and even some temporary weapons like a bubble gun that let you bypass the entire hole digging thing for a little bit. You can even get literal bombs and just turn the game into Bomberman for a minute. Grabbing shovels will extend the amount of holes you can dig at one time, which makes no sense, but I'm here for it. Losing a life will remove these power-ups, but it won't be long before you find some more. The peppy music and approachable learning curve make this a super easy-going game literally anybody can play. though after about 15 levels or so, it does get a little bit repetitive. Boss fights are a thing, but not really. There's only a couple of them, and they still revolve around the same concept of getting all the treasure chests to win. But just when Cratermaze starts to feel a little bit stale, you can always try out the difficult mode, which is actually just a better version of the game in my opinion. Here you have way more enemies that move much faster, and you can fall into your own holes, which is a sentence I hope I never have to say again. Difficult mode gives the game some real spice and makes it substantially harder, but in my opinion, it also just makes the game a lot more engaging. Nothing wrong with the default mode, of course, especially if you just want to have a chill session with it, but for me, difficult mode and expert mode, which is even harder, are where you get the most bang for your buck. You have to exist as one of 3 pinball games on the TurboGrafx-16, and the other 2 are absolute legends, Alien Crush and Devil's Crush, you're bound to fall through the cracks and wind up forgotten by most, and that's exactly what seems to have happened to Time Cruise, despite it being a pretty decent little pinball game. Time Cruise has a time travel theme with lots of alien technology and futuristic doodads scattered around a rather large board. It's a bigger board than either of the Crush games, in fact. Not as densely packed or as interesting, but still kind of impressive. I like how chaotic it is as you scroll up, down, and even horizontally all over the place with multiple sets of flippers all around to keep you busy flipping switches and slamming into things everywhere you end up. Some things seem kind of haphazardly placed, like somebody just threw a bunch of pinball things in the air and this is where they all landed. The overall design of the board works well enough, but some spots are more interesting to hang around in than others. The main thing you'll mostly be shooting for, though, is powering up these various time capsules around the board, jumping into them, and overcoming the bonus levels they take you to for an extra ball. These bonus stages are cool diversions, as they don't play like pinball at all, but rather other ball-oriented games, like this one, which simulates tilting the board around with the directional buttons to get the ball to roll in certain directions. This one's extremely tough and kind of annoying, but also sort of addicting in its own way. I like this one a lot better, which is more of a Plinko-style game where you try to direct the ball into the center hole at the bottom by controlling these platforms as it falls. This one almost feels like it could be its own game if they expanded on it a little bit. There's not a whole lot more to say about Time Cruise outside of that. It's a reasonably fun video pinball game that brings a couple of neat ideas to the table. It gets mostly everything right, but still can't quite compete with the likes of Alien and Devil's Crush. And I strongly suspect that's a big part of why nobody really talks about it. Game pros seemed to like it back in the day, though not as much as Crew Ball for the Genesis. I don't know, I'd say they're roughly on the same level. If you like video pinball games, I think Time Cruise is worth snatching up. We started this video with a shmup, so we're gonna end it with one too. Somehow, Ordyne continues to elude so many people. It's never really brought up in conversations about shmups, cute-em-ups, or turbo games, and yet it's a great example of all these things. It plays more or less like Cotton or Magical Chase, where you shoot stuff up on a horizontal plane, listen to upbeat music, collect crystals, and occasionally pop into a store to buy various upgrades. Unfortunately, the weapon upgrades here are all temporary and don't last too long, but they are fun while you've got them. Your base weapon is what you'll be using most of the time, though, as well as your bombs, which are good for enemies lower than you and in hard-to-reach spots. Most of the boss battles and level layouts seem designed to encourage you to use both the main shot and the bombs, which I like. It gives you just a little bit more to think about and keeps the game from feeling too simple, though complexity isn't really a focus in Ordyne anyway. Overall, I think the difficulty is probably on the lower end most of the time, but some isolated sections can get really overwhelming, especially for a cute-em-up, like when this underground cave starts collapsing while you're being bombarded by a dozen or so enemies at the same time. Losing a life, of course, also means losing all of your weapon upgrades, but you don't have to go to a checkpoint, which I appreciate in any shooter. You also occasionally come across this strange gambling game where you try to stop this thing on a number that gives you a good prize, but I've never really been able to get it to do what I want. I guess that's just the gambling element. Ordyne's graphics are definitely on the simpler side, but I like the use of color. It's not overly bright and colorful like most Q-em-ups, but it uses the Turbo's color palette well, with a good sense of variety between the levels and pretty decent enemy designs. It's not gonna knock your socks off, but it does stand apart from other Q-em-ups well, I think. Now, the music is less impressive, but also it fits the tone of the game well enough. But coming from Namco, the same publisher that brought Splatterhouse and Dragon Spirit to the Turbo, I can't help but be a little bit disappointed in how the music doesn't even approach the awesomeness of those games. Ah well. Generally, Ordyne gets most of what it does right. I wish it had excelled a little bit more with the graphics and/or the music to stand out a little bit more, but I can still easily recommend the game overall. Every now and then, I'll jump into this one for half an hour or so, and I always walk away from it having enjoyed myself. Now, the arcade version is on PSN via the Arcade Archives, and I will be covering that version in a future video at some point. But take it from me, this is a totally legitimate way to play the game too, so feel free to do that or both. I think it's time more people played this game. So, if you enjoy the TurboGrafx but maybe just haven't explored it to the depths that you would like to, I think these games might be a good place to start. And there's still another couple dozen games that are similarly sort of forgotten like this that I'd also like to bring up, so if you enjoyed the video, feel free to interact with it somehow to let YouTube know that you liked it, and maybe I'll do a follow-up. Also, feel free to mention other games in the comments that maybe you feel are under-discussed or unfairly forgotten. But until then, as always, thanks for watching.